I wanted to make this video because I saw an article in Field & Stream recently that talked about how meat infected with chronic wasting disease possibly caused the death of 2 people. I posted a quote from the original paper on my community tab, but I still had major unanswered questions about chronic wasting disease, or CWD. The main point of this video is to try to give an unbiased answer to the question, how dangerous is chronic wasting disease to humans? I will also address the possibility of eradicating, or at the very least significantly limiting, the spread of chronic wasting disease. So with that in mind, the first point that I'd like to make is that when mad cow disease was first discovered in Britain, the British government told people for years that you would not be harmed by eating infected meat. They were obviously wrong because over 100 people have died from eating contaminated meat. We have been told for a long time that CWD probably can't affect humans, which is why I make that point. Next, I want to point out that even though chronic wasting disease is 100% fatal to a deer that is infected with it, that is quite different from a disease that is immediately fatal. So in my opinion, it is not likely that deer are going to significantly benefit from natural selection here, because a sick deer can still reproduce before it actually gets sick enough to die from the disease, which means that the deer that are most susceptible are not necessarily being selected out before they can reproduce. Does live longer than bucks, which means that when they get infected, they can have a greater overall contamination of the environment and greater chance that they make it to the final stages of CWD, and that's what eventually kills them. Likewise, the prion disease called scrapie that affects sheep and goats has been around since at least 1732. Sheep today are not becoming resistant to it either. Chronic wasting disease is not going to just go away if we wait long enough. Let's start off with a simple explanation on how prion diseases work. When a deer gets infected with chronic wasting disease, that deer has had prions from another deer somehow enter its body, likely through transfer of saliva. Those prions that cause chronic wasting disease are misfolded, and when they enter healthy prions that naturally occur in the deer, they begin to misfold those healthy prions. Misfolded prions then accumulate in the brain and start to damage it, causing many small holes. Among the problems caused by this brain damage is the weight loss or wasting away of the deer, as it is not eating like a normal deer would. Other prion diseases like mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans also cause brain damage in the same way. Mad cow disease is technically called bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE. The spongiform part of that name comes from the fact that the brain is basically being turned into a sponge with all the holes in it. And when a human gets infected from mad cow disease, it is diagnosed as variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, or VCJD. Now, I want to talk about a couple of people from the same hunting lodge who died after eating deer meat that was infected with chronic wasting disease. Case number 1 had a history of eating infected meat and showed signs of rapidly occurring confusion and aggression. These symptoms appeared only a month after this man's friend, who we'll call case number 2, had died from Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, another prion disorder. Despite the attempts to treat him, case number 1 died within a month of showing symptoms, and the cause of his death was also labeled as being Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Due to the difficulty of distinguishing the prions, we can't say with 100% certainty that it was chronic wasting disease that killed him. However, I think with common sense and with the symptoms being rapid onset aggression and confusion, I would say that it's very likely that the chronic wasting disease infected meat was what killed them. In New York, about 200 to 250 people attended a venison banquet. At this banquet, deer meat was served, which was later tested positive for chronic wasting disease. Only 80 of these people agreed to be monitored as part of a study to find out whether there was any harmful effects from consuming the meat. This study went on for a number of years and concluded that there was no significant changes to health and no conditions that could not be attributed to old age that were found. The more I think about this, the more I begin to wonder if any of the other people who were not included in this study later developed health problems, and unfortunately this is an unanswerable question. It is somewhat comforting to say that none of the people included in the study had any side effects. This would suggest that a single limited portion of meat that is infected with chronic wasting disease prions may have limited risk. Yet no one should knowingly eat such a thing because it is a completely unnecessary risk. 3 men developed rare neurological diseases after eating deer and elk meat at the same cabin. It was initially believed that 2 of the men had died from Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, and the third died from Pick's disease. After reanalysis, it was determined that 2 of them had no evidence of prion disease, and the third patient did in fact have Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. However, this man had only eaten meat at these feasts once. Also, there was no evidence that the deer and elk meat that was served had come from the areas that had significant amounts of chronic wasting disease. So the deaths and illnesses in this case may be out of the ordinary, but there is no strong evidence that chronic wasting disease infected meat is what caused them in this particular case. We can also look at earlier cases where there was a suspected connection between human illness and chronic wasting disease. By doing this, we can see that there are only 2 non-inherited cases of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease with a noted exposure to venison. One patient was a 61-year-old woman who ate local venison from an area that had endemic, aka persistent, chronic wasting disease. Another patient was a 66-year-old man who ate venison from 2 deer harvested in an area with endemic chronic wasting disease. Both the man and the woman tested positive for a specific common type of sporadically occurring Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. Sporadically occurring means that it is not inherited, it cannot be transmitted, and it happens spontaneously or without a known cause. This means that there is probably no connection with these 2 cases and chronic wasting disease. I should clarify that the 2 deer that the man ate both tested negative for chronic wasting disease. This study then makes a few conclusions, one of them being that with the testing they've done, that suggests that chronic wasting disease is inefficient at converting human prions with low-level exposure, which means that prions in humans can get misfolded by CWD, and that because of this, humans probably can get infected if they have a significant amount of exposure. Also, the transmission of mad cow disease to humans and the resulting variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is a sign that the species barrier probably doesn't completely protect humans from getting infected with chronic wasting disease. This 2004 study also made a couple of conclusions that may not be true anymore. The first conclusion being that since there hasn't been any increase in Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, the risk to humans from infection with chronic wasting disease is relatively low. Over the years, and especially recently, the amount of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in the US has been increasing. So it may be that exposure to chronic wasting disease in humans is somehow quietly leading to higher rates of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's. We can't make a really exact correlation between the increase of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's and the number of infected deer, because we don't exactly know how many deer have been infected over the years. What we can do, however, is show that the areas with infected deer has continuously grown larger, just like how the increase of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans has also continuously gotten larger. When people were getting sick from mad cow disease or variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans, the amount of cases was relatively little compared to the amount of people naturally getting regular Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. The cases of sporadic or regular Creutzfeldt-Jakob's is colored in red, and the cases of mad cow disease infection are colored in green. Which means if people are already getting infected from chronic wasting disease infected meat, the moderate increase of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's shown in the statistics would be what we'd expect from such a disease. The other conclusion that this 2004 study made was that there seemed to be no link between chronic wasting disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. I mentioned before that the 2 hunters seemed to have died from Creutzfeldt-Jakob's after eating infected meat. So I think it's reasonable to state that the risk of illness from contact with infected deer is somewhat low, but definitely not zero. With that said, under no circumstances should anyone knowingly eat infected meat. you should get any deer you harvest tested for chronic wasting disease. If you are hunting with a group and you have multiple deer being harvested, you need to keep the meat from each deer clearly labeled and separate in the case that you need to get rid of it if the deer tests positive. Likewise, after you butcher a deer, you should clean your knives and possible contaminated surfaces like tabletops with diluted bleach. Testing has shown that soaking stainless steel in a 40% household bleach mixture for a minimum of 5 minutes will deactivate the chronic wasting disease prion. It wouldn't hurt to err on the side of caution and use a higher bleach concentration as long as it doesn't start to corrode things. I really want to emphasize that you should not eat the meat until you get the results back that your deer has tested negative. Cooking meat or soaking meat in bleach will definitely not deactivate the prions either. It will still be dangerous. You should also wear rubber gloves when touching the meat and really avoid touching the organs as much as possible. Especially avoid touching the brain or spinal cord. Also, if you see a dead or dying deer on your property, you would want to avoid getting near it, especially if it looks diseased or emaciated. I want to make a couple more important points though. First of all, chronic wasting disease is much more easily spread than other prion diseases, so it's quite unique because of this. Second of all, people do make mistakes and don't always use good judgment. People have been exposed to it already and will continue to get exposed to it as long as it's around. And it will be around for a very long time since we have no practical way of removing it from the environment. Once it is in the environment, it just keeps getting spread around by deer as well as scavengers like coyotes. Deer will also drink more water and urinate more sometimes when they are infected, which increases the amount of environment that is being contaminated. Just because someone doesn't show symptoms after being exposed to an infected deer does not mean that they aren't infected. Prion diseases can have very long incubation periods, so it may be possible that humans can only show symptoms years after exposure. Next, prion diseases have different strains, just like other infectious diseases. And the more infectious a disease is, the more likely it may change over time. Given that chronic wasting disease is so infectious, it is possible that a strain of it that is highly infectious to humans will appear sometime in the next 20 or 10 years. We already have research from 2022 that when scientists infected voles with chronic wasting disease prions, this changes the behavior of the prions, which would suggest that new strains of chronic wasting disease can almost certainly develop in the wild after passing through a new species animal that isn't a deer or elk. Back in 2018 even, a new atypical form of chronic wasting disease was found in 3 different moose in Norway. This is why I get irritated when people refer to chronic wasting disease as a scare tactic or as a political disease. Some people see chronic wasting disease as being used as a political tool to create fear or as an excuse to throw government money away into more research. I would say that it's not right for the government to use regulations to destroy a deer breeder's livelihood once chronic wasting disease is found in their herd. However, a lack of appropriate behavior on the part of the government does not make chronic wasting disease a problem of a political nature. CWD is inarguably a biological issue, not a political one, as it is a disease. And if someone wants to try to portray it as a political problem, I would question either their motives or their ability to think critically. Likewise, frightening headlines and news articles do not make chronic wasting disease a scare tactic. I understand why some people are so unwilling to trust the government and media. However, if the government and media say that chronic wasting disease is a problem, that doesn't mean that every mention of chronic wasting disease is just an attempt to manipulate you. The reason I have to mention these things is because trust in our basic institutions have been severely undermined. The result of this is that a minority of people now have zero trust in the media and government, and would rather use conspiracy as an easy answer for everything instead of going to the effort of being objective and doing more research. Now, I wanted to end this video on a more positive note, because I do believe that we can make things better in the future. We put a man on the moon and we dug the Panama Canal. If we are motivated enough to fix a problem, we can fix it. Some people have been trying to develop a vaccine for chronic wasting disease, and when they tested it in elk, they were able to detect an immune system response. However, this response was temporary, and we don't know if a vaccine could offer any significant protection to elk or deer, as it has never been done before. All of this so far is a step in the right direction, and the possibility that we might limit chronic wasting disease with vaccines years in the future. I say years in the future because this is not an easy thing to accomplish. Also, we know that some deer have genes that make them far more resistant to the disease. For example, Greg Fleece had a deer farm where it had gotten to the point where 60% of the deer tested positive. Because of this, he got rid of the deer that had the susceptible genes, and he started breeding deer specifically to make them more resistant. Because of this, his CWD-resistant deer that are currently being harvested from that same farm are now all testing negative despite the fact that they clearly have been exposed to the CWD prions still in the environment. Greg explains that this means we can keep selectively breeding deer for more and more resistance to chronic wasting disease, to the point where they may die of natural causes before they can ever test positive for it. As a side note, certain genetics in humans make some people more resistant and some people more susceptible for Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease. We as a nation, and also at the global level, we really don't have a long-term plan to fight chronic wasting disease. The majority of what we're doing right now is monitoring, testing, and trying to limit the spread. We don't really have any good solutions to the problem right now. We should already have a plan in place in case a variant of chronic wasting disease has already evolved or evolves in the future that poses a significant threat to human health. Even if we did have a potential chronic wasting disease vaccine, it would still encounter serious resistance in the regulatory and public support department. I say this because this is exactly what happened when people wanted to develop and test the rabies vaccine on wild animals. If people definitely know rabies can hurt them, think of how much more resistance there would be if people believe that chronic wasting disease not only can't hurt them, but isn't really that big of a problem. The only long-term solution that I can think of would be to high fence off the areas with high chronic wasting disease, trying to kill all the deer inside, and then repopulate those areas with deer that are genetically resistant to chronic wasting disease. I'm not saying that this is a good idea. I'm saying that it's literally the only thing that I can think of that might have the possibility of being a lasting solution. It would be obviously unpopular, expensive, and I question if it would even be practical. If any of you have possible solutions to this problem, I'd like to hear them in the comment section.